Hello and welcome to the Art of Lecturing. I'm Natasha and I will be joined by my co-host Sahana, and today we will be discussing adapting academia during the COVID-19 pandemic.
In March 2020, higher education was moving along as typical when suddenly in the UK we had major lockdowns throughout the country and we had to very abruptly stop teaching in person to students and move online when the vast majority of us did not have the experience to do that. We had to move our various teachings online to Teams and Zoom and other online software as well. So, any stats on that, Natasha?
Alright, so stats time. So during the autumn term of 2020, so at this point we've had a couple of lockdowns during the summer. Students are coming back to university.
That's what we thought.
That's what we thought, yes. And it very abruptly moved back online again. And during this term, 29% of students reported being dissatisfied with their academic experience. And actually over half, 53%, felt very dissatisfied with their social experience as well, which is kind of an important aspect for students, I think, as well. And students reported lower levels of life satisfaction, happiness and higher levels of anxiety and depression compared to the general population during this time.
Yeah, and it's very understandable. Like when you think about the social side, so many students are moving away from their homes, living with their parents and families, and coming to live on campus that's quite far away. So the social part of it is kind of what makes them feel like a community and not feel like they're isolated. So when you didn't have that during COVID, when you were stuck inside a room for most of the time, it's very understandable why a lot of satisfaction levels were low and why isolation levels were quite high as well.
Yeah, and I think as well, generally we probably as staff did see this as well. So from my perspective, I started teaching in September 2020, so I truly had to learn how to teach online during COVID lockdowns in my bedroom, because I was a PhD student at the time, so I was living in a shared house, which was not ideal. And so you're kind of stuck in this room, and then you're just kind of looking at a screen full of often just blank sort of webcams, because students didn't want to kind of put their cameras on, and as staff that's very isolating as well, and probably led to some dissatisfaction from the staff side kind of during this period as well.
Definitely. So in my own personal experience, I had taught for one academic year in person before we kind of moved online in September 2020. So I had the experience of where I could compare my own teaching experience in person to online, and I could sort of gauge what students were experiencing as well based on what they were saying and just sort of how they were behaving and engaging, how I'd seen them in person and how it was really online. And I definitely agree, the blank screens was a very demotivating thing to experience as as someone who's educating, really. Like, you would sort of turn on Teams, log on, I would have my, a happy smile, because you want to be like very enthusiastic and motivated, which is very hard to do during that time anyway because of lockdown, and turn on my screen and I would have like 30 odd people logged on online in the meeting, but I wouldn't see anyone, right? So I'm just sort of like giving my sessions into the void. It seems like you don't know if people are listening, if students have just sort of turned on and joined the meeting but they've just gone off somewhere. You never really know, and it's very, very demoralising to just give a lecture or a teaching session to 30, 40 odd students when you don't even know if they're there because you can't see anything. And it's a thing of when you're teaching in person, we can kind of judge, right, based on how many people are nodding, whether or not students fall asleep, for example, how engaged they are based on their facial expressions. So you can kind of change things, right? If people look really, really confused, I often stop and I'll go back and I'll sort of go back over something. I'll ask questions. If I'm getting nods, okay, that's great. But we can't judge that when you're teaching online. But even if you ask those questions, like put your, you can do like thumbs up and wave your hands and all of these things in Zoom and Teams. Even if you ask students, that most people don't engage doing that. So even then, it's like I can ask the same questions, but I'm not getting the same feedback or facial expressions from students. So it was very hard to actually teach anything and feel like students were getting anything out of what was being taught to them.
Yeah, and to be fair, there were some kind of methods and activities used to try and help student engagement. So breakout rooms was something that we commonly use, because I often did quite a lot of like kind of seminars, tutorials, kind of 1 hour sessions. And so I'd get a group of maybe like 30 students, and then I'd put them into like sort of groups of 4.
Yeah.
And then in that group of 4, they're given a sort of an activity for kind of 15, 20 minutes, and then I kind of just pop in and out of the rooms. So, there's a little bit less pressure if they need to ask me a question, but also they're only having to work with like a small group of people. And I would say that actually worked for the majority of the time. So I think at the time, York did have a policy of try and put your camera on if you can. And I would say like maybe like 70% of students did that. You would get some students with their camera off, but they seem to engage. I think that kind of brings in, often these students are at home with younger siblings, pets, people that, parents who are working from home, so they couldn't have their camera or their microphone on because, you'd be picking up the dog barking.
And that's another thing, right? Like, so if you're thinking about the home environment for students, they weren't necessarily set up to do online learning, to be able to turn on your camera, because as you said, there's noise going on in this background. There are other people living in these homes, right? So even if you're like, oh, I'm going to keep my bedroom quiet, it doesn't mean the other people in the household can be quiet. A similar thing for staff as well. Like, I was not set up to try and teach from home at all. I didn't, I had a laptop, of course, but it wasn't really set up to be able to do like webcam work and things like that. My webcam was terrible, right? You could barely see my features in it, but I didn't have the money to try and spend and buy a new one because we didn't know how long this was going to take as well. Trying to set up the infrastructure to teach online as well, that was a huge undertaking because trying to translate so many of the in-person, work that we do to online, it doesn't work very well, A lot of the breakout room stuff, it worked better as we went on, but a lot of it was very much trial and error. So I know that we primarily used Teams for our teaching, and at that point Teams did not have inbuilt breakout rooms, so we had to do this, and which is very frustrating to do in a teaching session. It's like 1 hour, just try and set up multiple different links, label them as like different rooms and get students to move to those rooms, and then you'd have to manually go in and check each of those rooms. But that wouldn't be part of the main meeting. So you would try and go into those rooms, and after a while, some students wouldn't go to the room that you allocate them to. So you would have like a group of 30 people, but in one room you might have 2 people, and in another room you might have 10 people. Right? And we can't forcibly move people into another room if they don't want to be there, right? And it was very difficult to try and manage that when I'm not an expert on technology or teaching online. That wasn't something that I was trained on. And even in that, I was also very new to teaching in general at that point as well. So trying managing this when even those who were experienced educators, they didn't know much about it either. So it wasn't like I could turn to them and be like, this isn't working, what do we do? It was just learning on the job and figuring out as we go, can we do this? Can't we do this? Type of thing as well. It did get better as we kind of got used to it and, practice, and we trialled different things as well. But it was a very big learning period that was very, very stressful because we still had to deliver good quality education to the students when we ourselves didn't know how to provide that on this sort of online platform that we weren't really using much either prior to that.
Yeah, luckily we use Zoom, so it did have a breakout rooms function, and I could kind of allocate people if they couldn't get to the room themselves. So luckily that was a little bit streamlined for us. But again, I had never taught before.
Oh, yeah.
So I was like, is this how you do it? how does one kind of teach in general, let alone online? And I think luckily, I've mentioned, I was at York, but yeah, they kept it quite simple in terms of the activities. And, just very simple kind of little group sort of discussion things. But it was also really odd trying to navigate the Blackboard, which is kind of like Moodle.
It's the online learning virtual environments that universities will have different names for them depending on what it is. BLE, Blackboard, various other names for them typically.
And so, you're kind of trying to put all these activities on there as well, and make sure links are working, because often these students are doing things at different times of the day, different times of the night, and kind of trying to get everyone into that seminar with the same amount of preparation work, the same amount of reading done, was also quite difficult.
So one of the issues that we faced was that due to the lockdown in the UK and lockdown in various places around the world, so I was at a very international institution before, a lot of our students couldn't actually come into the UK. So many of the resources were geo-locked for them, depending on which country they were in. They wouldn't be able to access a number of different resources. And another big issue that we had was the timings of lectures and seminars and practicals, because we would have students all the way from parts of America to Australia and all the different time zones. So we had this very awkward situation of we can't just schedule everything at 10 to 1 in the morning, because that might be midnight for other students. But we can't, for our own sake, we can't be scheduling things at 7 p.m. because then we are working such a long day. But I did have that, and I did sometimes actually have working days where I was teaching at 9, have another seminar at 2 and another one at 6, because we have to cater to the students' needs as well to some extent. And if as a student, through no fault of your own, you cannot come into country, you have certain time zone differences, then it would be very unfair for the students for us to say, doesn't matter, you just have to wake up at 2 a.m. in the morning and come to a 10 a.m. seminar in UK time. So we had to do that, right? And that was quite a big burden for us as educators, because that is not something that we typically had to consider. But it also meant that our working days were a lot longer. And it's a thing of if you work in an office, often at that point, at least for myself, once I left the office, it was okay, I'm kind of done now. But I was teaching from my bedroom, so it never felt like I left the office or I left work. I was always working because my laptop was there and I had to work. All the time. It never felt like I could separate. I couldn't even go outside either. So it felt as very little separation. But there were so many different issues that we had to sort of, face with students. So things like we had many students who didn't have the infrastructure to sort of use laptops or, cameras and audio and things like that. So we found it very hard to actually do discussions and breakouts. So one of the things that we sort of ended up coming up with was trying to have breakout rooms that were video or audio only or chat only to try and cater to different student needs and their technological needs. It kind of worked well in that students who perhaps didn't have a technology in place, or perhaps didn't feel turning on their video or turning on their audio, had a safer space to still do their discussion, still take part, without feeling like they were kind of pointed out and be like, oh, you have to be in this room or whatnot. I think it worked well. But it also meant that we often find that most students go towards the chat only or the audio only one, and they don't really turn on the video, which is perfectly fine, because I myself don't want to turn on my video most days. I don't really feel ready for that. I don't want people to see the background of my bedroom, and you have all these blur effects and things like that, but they don't work perfectly fine. Sometimes you move and suddenly a spot is visible in the background.
You can't really hide the fact that your bed is right there.
Yeah, exactly. You can't really hide that, right? And there's it's just a level of privacy that you feel was constantly being sort of crossed, right? The lines of privacy that felt very uncomfortable, and I didn't really know what to do. I was living with my family at the time, so it wasn't I could just be my family were very nice actually. They wouldn't come upstairs, wouldn't make any noises, but it's very hard for them to not access half the house during a working week, right? But a lot of these different challenges that everyone was kind of facing in different ways depending on where you were living. as well, which was quite hard to handle. And for students, they must have faced so many different challenges as well overall.
Because I think initially in that sort of autumn 2020 term, I think the government encouraged students to move into halls,
Yes.
to move into student shared homes. And then, after that kind of Freshers Week, it was lockdown. So they've moved into these kind of student spaces and not allowed to leave.
Yeah, and also because at that point they would have paid for the student
Yes.
spaces for the year as well. So the thing of like, oh, even if they left, they still have all this money that they would have spent. It's very expensive accommodation. It's not cheap by any means. So they were stuck in this bit of, oh, I could stay here on the off chance that university will open up in the next couple of weeks, which it didn't.
It did not.
And they became very, very isolated. So isolation levels were so high during this time. But students were particularly affected because they didn't have a lot of the support levels in place, Like currently, if we have personal tutor meetings, I will meet with my students in person. We can chat about it. Just the fact that there's another human being sitting in front of you is helpful to talk to. But to do that online when you're stuck in quite literally a room as well, and all these people that are very, very new that you don't really know, can be quite hard as well. I think I know with our first year students, the ones who sort of started university in September 2020, they were the ones who we had the most difficulty trying to get them to engage in discussions and things like that, because they literally didn't know any of the other students. At least for second and third year students in discussion groups and things like that, they often knew the other face or the name, so they felt a bit more comfortable. But many of the first year students, they literally knew no one.
Yeah, and I think it's difficult as well as a kind of a fresh year one student coming to university. They don't know the staff, they don't know any of the students, and then you're kind of told to just, you're not allowed to go and meet them.
Yeah.
And it must have been incredibly isolating and odd to just be meeting your teachers, basically, online and via email. And I imagine as personal tutors, we probably couldn't have provided the amount of support that was probably necessary during this time. Yeah,
so one of the things that I know we did, so in September 2020, when we had all these first year students who were just really struggling to engage and saying that they felt very isolated, so we kind of like learnt from that, took it forward, and in the following semester, so January 2021, during one of the modules we taught on, like with the very first sort of teaching session we had, rather than actually teaching anything, we had a speed dating event for all the students who joined into each session. We would put them into like one-to-one sort of little breakout rooms, and we had like answer and ask questions, but none of it was related to psychology. It was more like, what is the current TV show you're binge watching? What are your favourite sports activities? All these little things that is just helping the students to get to know them. Because if usually the student union and universities will put on these different events where students can get to know each other. But because of COVID, that wasn't happening. So it kind of came to an understanding that if that's not happening there, then we will have to do that on module levels and course levels to make sure that students are making those social connections, that they do feel comfortable with their cohort as well. And we definitely got very good feedback from that, the students, because they had experienced the first semester of that not happening. Now that in second semester, the fact that they kind of could have a chat, and the fact is that it wasn't just the students doing it either, ourselves as sort of the educators, we joined in on it as well, so they got to know us as well. It wasn't just a student thing, but actually you get to know, myself as one of the GTAs, you get to know the module leader, you get to know other people as well, which I think worked quite nicely, because as someone who was teaching, it was quite nice to actually have one-on-one conversations with students and actually just get to know them and to see their faces and things like that as well. But for students to actually also meet other people, even if they were many, many miles away from the actual, university where they were.
Yes, I think there was definitely some things that worked kind of once we got maybe kind of through the midpoint of the year. We kind of realised that, right, student engagement is down, we need to increase student engagement, but I suppose one of the cons on that is because we're having to do it on a departmental level. It was a lot of extra work for staff.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like staff, we were so stressed during that time. So March 2020, up until lockdown actually finished, because trying to translate lectures, practical seminars into online things is very hard, because a lot of VLE, so virtual learning environments, were not set up to handle that. I'm sure the IT departments of various universities were very much overworked and overloaded with a number of questions as well. But it's very hard, right? Because our sort of pedagogic practices are often the way we teach are for in-person settings. So that's what we look into. That's what we know.
Yeah.
I didn't know much about pedagogic practices online until we kind of had to do it, right? So we're kind of learning on the go about what works, but also not just sort of reading research and implementing it, but also just literally learning as we're going, depending on what we're doing as well. And trying to do that was a very, very stressful time, I think, for staff. I think as a new teacher, educator, it was even more stressful, because at least I had some experience and I had a bit more confidence in teaching, right? So things like silences and pauses, I kind of had gotten used to, and if the class was silent, I had the level of going, okay, you're silent, that's fine, but I do want people to kind of share something. But I can imagine as a new educator, if you weren't even used to teaching beforehand, to go and try and do that online, where it wasn't working well at that point, to try and teach must have been a bit of a nightmare.
It really was, and I was just thinking, I don't think I was asked a question until my second year of teaching, when we moved back to face-to-face. Because even if there was people with their cameras on, no one ever asked anything.
Oh, no, yeah.
So, you'd be there, and my first year was really learning just kind of delivery, and just delivering kind of information and kind of educational activities.
Yeah.
But not really knowing how to do that with a room full of actual people.
Yeah.
Very, very strange.
Probably felt a bit like you're talking into the mirror, isn't it? Because you can see yourself in like one of the little boxes, so it's just often yourself talking and just blank screens.
Yeah, honestly, I think it's like the whole Black Mirror thing. You're just kind of looking at either a picture of you or a completely black screen with some PowerPoint slides.
Yeah, and it can be quite distracting, actually, because you would have a chat box as well, so you'd be in your flow, and then suddenly the chat would occasionally go off, right? You're just saying, like, I don't quite know what to do. Do I answer the chat questions? Do I continue with what I'm kind of doing here? And things like that. And then you have the thing of, if you have your PowerPoint up, you can't see the chat. So you're a bit like, oh, if you have a question, please unmute yourself and ask me, but no one will ever do that until you come back and finish. In the end, 5 minutes, you suddenly have a bunch of questions that I don't have enough time to cover this in the 5 minutes left either.
Yeah, and one thing as well was where I was at during COVID. We had like a 30 to 40 minute time limit on our seminars and lectures. Not because they needed to, travel to other parts of campus. It was purely like just to help student engagement. So rather than having sort of 2 hours or 1 hour sessions, we went for sort of shorter ones, which I think did help. It probably helped the students more in case of like, okay, they don't have to sit in silence watching for 2 hours or an hour. But, it's a little bit quicker. You can get kind of 1 or 2 activities done. But other than that, it's a little bit more, here's the information, have a little discussion, ask a few questions, and then, go away and kind of do the sort of self-taught aspects of, reading and research.
Yeah, and we did try loads of different things during COVID. So I know I designed like a practical where we used like flipped classroom learning, which is the idea that you kind of have a video recorded or something like that students will watch beforehand, and then they will come to the actual session, which will be online, where we would sort of discuss it, and they would talk through any problems or issues that they kind of faced. It worked okay. But it was very much a thing of like the students who were very engaged, they engaged. The students who did not engage, type of thing. So it's very much like, we tried loads of different things. And I think flipped classroom learning is something we'll discuss more in one of the future episodes, actually.
So stay tuned.
Yeah, do stay tuned. So that is getting towards the end of our podcast today, and as a sort of takeaway point, I suppose, to everyone listening, academia is kind of really ever growing and it's ever evolving industry, really, and it is facing many challenges, as we saw with COVID as well. So I do think being adaptable is a really, really important skill set to have in academia, whether you're been in academia for a very long time, or you're sort of looking to come into academia, or you're sort of an early career educator, being adaptable is very important. Just because different universities work in different ways, but we also have so many challenges that we're facing at so many moments. It is very important to be adaptable, I think.
Oh yeah, and I think as well, lessons were learned during COVID. And I think some places have even indeed kept that hybrid format and maybe even perfected it as well, which kind of does help the flexibility and
It definitely does.
adaptability.
Yeah, and it is something that we're seeing now because of the experiences of COVID and the use of Teams and Zoom and things like that. You know, students are wanting things to be more flexible. We ourselves as staff have, you know, depending on where you are, more flexible work practices and things like that. So there are some positives that have come out of it as well. So for example, you know, certain workplaces before you had to be in 5 days a week. Now it's like you come in 2 days of the week, or the days you're working, or 3 days a week, and so on. And you know, there are many different things that we have learnt from that as well, that have been useful, I think.
Yeah, and I imagine we'll probably pick up on those in a future episode.
We will do. And that is the end of the episode. Do come along to the next one, where we will be discussing the use of AI in higher education.